Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld.Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and this video is about Chapter Approved 2022 and what it means for Craftworld Eldar. We're obviously jumping the gun a little bit here because we don't have the new codex yet, so how Craftworld players approach primary scoring and secondary scoring clearly is going to change a lot in the next couple of months, and I'm going to wait until that book is out to make new strategy guides about how to approach primaries and how to approach secondaries and weigh in on all of that. So that's not what's happening today. All I'm going to do is run listeners through the biggest changes to the game in Chapter Approved 2022. By the way, if you've already read and digested this carefully and thought a lot about it, there might not be a whole lot in this video for you, right? I am going to weigh in with a couple of inferences I'm making about how some of this is going to change the game and what it means for Craftworld players. But a lot of what I'm going to do is just run listeners through how the game is different. And so now's your chance to jump ship if this particular video is redundant with things you already know. But so here's the situation. This is Chapter Approved has significantly changed 40K matched play. There's some big differences in terms of what sorts of army constructions are legal. The whole way that we score in primary missions has changed, and how one gets to 45 points for primaries has changed rather significantly. And then there are some not as large but not insignificant changes to the secondaries that may alter what's viable, what's best, and maybe how many resources we need to allocate to new versions of secondaries that we were relying on earlier. So let's start with how army construction has changed. Here's the big one. If you haven't already heard, sub-faction soup is dead. So what that means is in matched play, in competitive play, a player can no longer bring two detachments from different sub-factions within the same faction. So if you're an orc player, you can't bring two different orc clans. If you're a Craftworlds player, you can't bring two different Craftworlds. You can still bring a detachment of Craftworlders and a detachment of Ynnari or a detachment of Harlequins or whatever, but you can't bring no more detachment with Masterful Shotists and Expert Crafters and another one with Hunters of Ancient Relics and Expert Crafters. That's dead. And for some factions, this is going to be a serious blow. Admech, for example, they had some really good competitive builds where they had one Mars detachment and one something else. And they were my personal boogeyman for the last few months. So I can't say I'm too broken up about what's happened to Sorry, Chris. Chris is my training partner and one of my best friends, and he's a big Admech player. He's really good. He's sad about this, but I'm not weeping any salty tears for Admech. It's hard to say exactly how this is going to land for Craftworlds post Codex, but any thoughts you may have had about Samhan bikes teaming up with Eand and Wraith constructs in 3 months after the new Codex drops are now limited to narrative play only. You could still run detachments with paint schemes from those different Craftworlds just for thematic reasons, but in matched play, you will only be able to apply a single subfaction bonus to the whole army. Now, I know that some players are probably going to be annoyed by this, and to be totally honest, I'm kind of happy about it, even if it does shut down some highly optimal builds. And I say this as somebody who is doing this a lot in both 8th and 9th edition. I was trying to build optimal Craftworlds lists by mixing and matching custom Craftworlds. But I honestly think that having different Craftworlds team up is so situational that it is kind of fundamentally a narrative move. The notion that your army would always find itself in that special narrative circumstance for every game has always struck me as a little bit odd. I mean, I guess you could make the same argument about having any named character on the field at any time. But frankly, aesthetically, I've never been a big fan of subfaction soup in a non-narrative setting. It just feels janky. So I'm pleased with this. And I also think that it might be the case that players, if you are forced to stick with a single faction and not bring, all of your bikers are obviously from the biker craft world, and all of your wraiths are obviously from the wraith craft. It might force us to be creative in ways that if we were not forced to do, maybe we wouldn't come up with some of the powerful combos that now we will come up with. Maybe it sounds like I'm just putting a positive spin on this, but I am happy about this, both from a narrative perspective and just for like a health of the game perspective. I think it's going to turn out to be a good thing in the long term. And again, narrative games, do what you want. The other changes to the rules, right, but sort of separate from missions themselves, are not nearly as significant as that. That one is a cataclysmic shift. But there are some other changes which might affect Craftworld players. One of them is that secondary selection for your secondary missions, secondary objectives, now happens after you roll for attack or defender and choose your deployment zones. Most of the time this won't matter, but if you have some like forward deploying units, and you know whether or not you're going to be able to screen out your opponent's forward deploying units, this could actually come into play in terms of deciding whether or not you want to try for certain secondaries. Again, I think for the vast majority of players in the vast majority of games, this is not a meaningful change, but sometimes it's going to matter a little bit. The other change that certainly right now affects Craftworlds not really at all, except maybe in a good way, is that you now have to choose at least 2 secondary objectives from the Grand Tournament 2022 Nachmund secondary objectives, which means if you have, so for those of you, maybe newer players who are still using the Craftworlds 8th edition codex and have not even looked at other codexes, you might not know, but 9th edition codexes give faction-specific secondaries to players that they can choose from in each of the categories, right? Or some of the categories, I guess. They haven't been great, to be honest. So there are really only a couple of armies that this affects that might have legitimately been choosing multiple faction-specific secondaries. So currently it's only good for us in that it hobbles the 1 or 2 armies that were doing this, and it probably doesn't really matter even post-codex unless we get multiple amazing secondaries that would work with the same build. And what I kind of expect to see in the new codex is we will have at least 1 good faction-specific secondary, maybe a couple. But if we do have a couple, they probably aren't necessarily going to be things that the same type of Craftworlds army would take. So I don't think this really affects how optimal Craftworlds are on the table, but it might be an obstacle to some of our opponents. So I guess in that sense, it's positive. So those are the rules changes. The other really big change is so the missions have all changed. If you're playing at 2,000 points, there are 9 new missions, and although some of them are in some ways quite similar, they have changed in significant ways from the missions in Chapter Approved from last year. So the first thing is that of those 9 missions, 7 are take and hold missions, and those are the missions where if you have 1 objective, you score 5 points. If you have 2, you score 10. If you have 3, or if you have more than your opponent, you score 15. Except the numbers have changed. So now it's 4 points for 1, 8 points for 2, and then 12 points for more than. And then 2 of the missions are domination missions, and that's where you have to have 2 objectives, primary objectives, to score at all for your 4 points, and then you need to have 3 to score at least 8, and then you get 12 if you have more than. So there used to be 3 missions like this, and now there are only 2. And also, the only 2 that there are both missions in which there are 6 objectives on the table. And this is good for us because Craftworlds have not historically been super durable, and one of the things that our space elves have not excelled at in 8th or 9th edition is standing on an objective and taking punishment while we wait for our next command phase. And so I think probably it's fair to say that in the first year of 9th edition, the hardest thing for Craftworlds players was to max out our score. We could do great with secondaries, right? But primaries, it was really hard for us to keep up in really competitive play. On the primaries, we had to get very, very clever about how we did that. And there were certain, in some cases, somewhat narrow strategies, and we relied on being able to shoot our opponents off of objectives pretty consistently. And I think that's all going to get a little bit easier because there are fewer missions in which we need to hold 2 to score at all, and in addition, well, now you only get to 30 points in this particular manner, and then you can get your other 15 points on primaries by doing other stuff. And here's the other big change. If you haven't already seen the new book, you can still get to 45 points for primaries in all the missions, but the objectives on the board will now not get you there. They will, if you do the math, you have to get a little bit creative. I mean, I guess if you got 12 points on turns 2, 3, 4, and 5, you'd be almost there. But who does that? So now the other thing that you'll have to be cognizant of is the additional primary scoring conditions for each mission, and each of the 9 missions has a different special condition for how you score those up to those other 15 points, usually up to those other 15 points. I think there's a couple of exceptions. And then in addition, there are the other weird quirks about command point regen that is either limited if you don't control certain objectives, or maybe get some bonus to it if you do control certain objectives. And so what we're going to do is walk relatively quickly through the sort of special conditions for each of the 9 missions, talk about how this is going to change the game a little bit. So the first mission, Recover the Relics, is one in which you get a CP for every unit destroyed on your turn up to 3. And here's the other thing. Not all of these additional primary scoring rules are about objective control. Sometimes it's about other stuff. And this, again, I think is going to be good for Eldar, because historically Craftworlds have been a pretty flexible army. And I think that this new emphasis on sort of different primary objectives baked in to the mission will reward more flexible armies. Oh, and by the way, if you remember the in the old chapter approved, each mission came with its own sort of optional secondary that the players could choose. Those are all gone. So now you have to choose at least two from the secondaries that are in the chapter approved book, and then one could come from your codex. They've also written objectives for factions that don't have, not Eldar though, because we're getting our codex pretty soon, but they've written like choice objectives for factions that are not due to get a codex anytime soon and don't have those options. But those secondary missions that existed in the old version of the book, in many cases, it is some version of that is the special primary scoring condition, and we'll see that as we go through in the new version of the mission. So the first mission, Recover the Relics, you get a CP for every enemy unit destroyed on your turn up to 3. So for armies that are good at target elimination, that's great. It's a way to score without having to stand on an objective and take punishment. You also only regain CP if you control at least one objective outside of your own deployment zone. And you regain an extra CP if you control an objective in your opponent's deployment zone. Now this, if you're a Craftworlds player who used to rely on holding the objective in your own deployment zone and then occasionally grabbing one in the middle of the table, and you're trying to get to like 35 or 40 on the primaries and max out your secondaries, that's going to be a little bit trickier as like a standby strategy, because that losing out on that CP regen, that could be a significant disadvantage. And not only are you being rewarded if you can take an objective in your opponent's deployment zone, but your opponent is being incentivized to take yours away from you. And Craftworlds are so fast and maneuverable that ultimately, I think post-Codex, we're probably going to be really good at adapting our army to whatever mission we happen to end up playing. And so I think in the long term, this is going to be good for us, but there could be a steep learning curve. Okay, so the second weird new mission, primary scoring condition, the mission is called Tear Down Their Icons. And in addition to the usual scoring criteria, this is all about planting bombs. So I think this is kind of the weirdest one of all of them. Once per turn, one of your infantry units can perform an action to plant a bomb if it's on your opponent's half of the board. And you put an objective marker down for that. And Also, one of your units can defuse a bomb for an action on your half of the board if you are within engagement range of it. At the end of the battle, you get 4 points for each bomb that detonates on your opponent's half of the table. Now, I think we are one of the changes that I think we're going to see in the game as a result of Chapter Approved 2022 is more MSU infantry units. I have a bunch of reasons for thinking that this is true. But if you're in a position to place infantry units in multiple places on your opponent's side of the table and then be able to decide where you're going to put bombs down and then the ability to get to your opponent's bombs, potentially this could completely swing the outcome of a game if you just have better board control with MSU infantry units than does your opponent. I'm hoping that it turns out that Craftworlds are quite good at this because historically that's what aspect warriors are. They are highly flexible, pretty quick infantry specialist units, and combined with things like rangers that maybe advance deploy. And in theory, we might end up being quite good at this. I think that that MSU infantry build that we're likely to see, at least for a while, will have other implications too that I'll talk about later. The next mission is Data Scry Salvage. So in this one, in addition to the normal scoring criteria, you score victory points equal to the number of objectives you control in no man's land if you perform an action on your own backfield objective, provided that there are no enemy units nearby. So you have to control your own backfield objective, and then the action that you perform gets you additional victory points for objectives that you control in the midfield. This is tricky because, again, historically, we've not been great at holding multiple midfield objectives. We're usually trying for the one in our backfield plus maybe one. And so this mission could be a little bit of a bear for us, but hopefully the Codex will give us some durable objective holders, and maybe it won't be an issue. But I suspect this one might be a little bit trickier for us than the others. The next one's called Abandoned Sanctuaries. In this mission, no units may advance deploy or make pre-game moves. Now, a lot of people are mad about this. I know the guys over at Goonhammer complained that any kind of a mission that shuts down advantages that you have paid points to get is, a bad mission. I certainly understand that sentiment, and there might be something to it. I kind of like the idea that you might, when you plan your army, you might have to allow for the possibility that you're not going to be able to rely on your advanced deploy units and then think differently about how you use them. I mean, maybe I'm just being thick-headed and optimistic here. It's possible. Maybe it's a stupid rule, but I think it's kind of interesting. There are certainly rumors. I mean, I think rumors aside, everybody seems to be getting at least some units that do this sort of thing. So this should land. I assume we'll have them in the new codex, and this should land on all of us, all 40K players. We're all going to be dealing with this, I think, to some degree, and we'll have to be thoughtful about how we plan. Eldar are so fast that I bet we're going to be able to play around this. I'm not really terribly worried about it. But at the end of each player's turn, you also score 2 VP if you did at least one of the following. You controlled an objective in the center of the board, and so you can see why they don't want pre-game moves, right? Because they don't want anybody to start with that center board objective. Or you destroyed an enemy unit within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. So this one could end up being a high casualty mission in which both players are incentivized to continuously throw units at the center of the board, and also incentivized to kill enemy units in the center of the board. I have no idea how this is going to play out for us with the new codex. I think hopefully we'll have some fast, hard-hitting, pretty inexpensive melee units that will enable us to trade efficiently and play this really well. You also get, for Abandoned Sanctuaries, 5 victory points at the end of the game if you control the center objective. And in really close games and tight games, that's going to be what swings it. And so this, again, might be one of those circumstances in which going second, probably, again, one of the things I think they're trying to do is cut down on any advantage that may or may not come with going first, and Abandoned Sanctuaries has a nice way of controlling that. Okay, conversion. Here's the next one. In the conversion mission, you only get CP in addition to the other primary scoring limitations or rules, you only get CP if your warlord remains alive. Okay, fine. Probably not a big deal for us. Could be rough on armies that have some sort of aggressive, suicidal trading warlord. That's not really Craftworlds, so I think it's probably fine. You get 4 victory points if you control an objective in your opponent's zone at the end of your turn. This actually could be really good for us, again, because we have really fast units that can rocket across the table. They don't need to stay alive. They just need to grab that thing, and then if they don't survive your opponent's turn, it's fine. You get 2 victory points if you control at least one objective in no man's land, and you lose a victory point if you don't control your own backfield objective, which is interesting. So in that sense, if you're running one of those Craftworlds armies that just abandons its own deployment zone on turn 1, and your thing is, I'm going to be really fast, I'll always be where you don't want me to be, and I'm going to keep all my stuff together to overwhelm whatever I'm engaging, well, now that might be getting reined in a little bit. It also might be worth giving up that 1 VP per turn if that's how your army plays and you can overwhelm them in other places on the board, but it is a complexity that we'll need to consider. The next new mission is called the Scouring. In the Scouring, in addition to normal scoring rules, a unit on an objective can perform an action called an Auspex scan, and if that unit is still alive in your next command phase, you score 3 victory points, and each objective can be scanned only once. This might end up being kind of tough for us, because historically, although Wraith units they're tough, and maybe they're going to get even tougher in the Codex, but they're not fast, right? So being able to do this on every objective on the board and then live on many objectives on the board and live to the next turn to do it again could be tricky. On the other hand, if you only do it a couple times, we should be able to do it at least twice and get to 6 points, but then you're consistently scoring 8 points per turn. You still do okay. You come out to 38. That's pretty close to 45. You probably don't need to do it everywhere on the board, but this one could be a little hard for us. Tide of Conviction. Okay, so for this mission, you get 2 victory points per turn for controlling the objective in your opponent's territory turns 1, 2, 3, and 4. And at the end of the game, you get 4 victory points for controlling your opponent's objective and 2 for every objective in the midfield to a maximum of 8, and you only regain CP if you control the objective in your own backfield. Again, this is one that incentivizes maybe suicidal assaults on your opponent's backfield objective, where you take it away, you lose it. And again, if we have points efficient, hard hitting, really fast melee units, we might actually be able to play this one really well. Death and Zeal, great name. In this mission, you gain 2 victory points at the end of the turn if one of the following conditions is met, and then 3 victory points if you meet both conditions. So the first one is you either take an objective on your turn, or you already control all of them on the board, so you can't take one. The other is you destroy an enemy unit that is sitting on an objective. And just curiously, detail in this mission, like in some of the 500-point play, players continue to control objectives after they move off of them, as long as an opponent doesn't claim them. And so that potentially lets you be sort of fast and forward if you can keep your opponent off your objective just by applying a lot of pressure. Maybe this works for you. Again, I think it's going to reward unit trading to some degree. And lastly, secure missing artifacts. Players have an opportunity to move objective markers up to 6 inches before the game begins, and the attacker does so twice. The defender does so once. This is very similar to a mission from last year's chapter approved. Each player then specifies one of the objective markers on their opponent's side of the board to be their opponent's priority objective. So you decide which objective your opponent has to defend for 3 VP at the end of their turn if they control the priority objective on their own half of the table. On the one hand, Craftworlds are not historically great at choosing a particular objective and holding it. On the other hand, when it's one that's near your deployment zone, we have always been good at making at least one unit incredibly durable. So I think that we'll have a lot of play with this one too. On the whole, I think all of these look solid. I think we're probably still going to have a harder time with missions that require us to hold 2 to score it all, and then 3 to get to 8. But in general, I think these are probably going to make the game more interesting. Armies are going to need to be a little bit more flexible and dynamic. Other things I think it means, and again, I've only gotten a couple of this is speculation. I've only played a couple of games with the new book, but I think that fast units that can seize objectives on your opponent's half of the board are going to be even more important. This is good for Eldar. We have a lot of them, but I think we're also going to see more of those units in our opponent's armies. And in the past, we've relied on being faster than our opponent, and this might mean that everybody needs to lean more into their faster units, and that could actually, if that changes the meta towards faster armies, that might be hard for Craftworlds, because we won't be able, there won't be as many matches in which we're just much faster than our opponents. I think unit trading is going to be a much bigger part. I think this is going to be actually the biggest change to the meta. I think that, not that unit trading isn't already a thing, it totally is. It's a big part of 40K, but I think that this is going to make it exponentially more so. Increasingly, players are going to need to move infantry units onto objectives on their opponent's half of the board to perform actions or take the objective and then die. And this means you're going to, like in chess, need to be thinking 2 or 3 trades ahead. And that's just going to be a different way of thinking about the game, and it's going to reward a different kind of army construction. Again, I think it's going to be good for us. I think that we probably will have hard-hitting, fast units that do this really well at sort of an optimal point cost. I think this is going to be a good meta for Eldar. Although, here's an interesting thing that maybe others of you have been thinking about this too, but I have rarely, even in playing small tournaments, 12 people or whatever, I rarely have come up against other Craftworlds lists. They're just not, there weren't a lot of people before running competitive Craftworlds armies. And so the other fast armies, the White Scars are pretty fast. New AdMech is ridiculously, if it's a certain kind of build, is ridiculously fast. And Drukhari are fast, and those kinds of matchups tended to be the hardest for us. But if the new codex is quite good and a lot of competitive players are running Craftworlds, you might have to start really thinking about how you're going to beat other Craftworlds armies. And that's just not a thing that we've really been worried about in 9th or 8th edition. So on the one hand, I think the meta is going to be better for Eldar. On the other hand, I think if there are a lot of people playing fast armies with a lot of the same strengths that we do, that's going to present its own set of challenges, which will be interesting. We might see fewer vehicles overall between new, really hard-hitting weapons like that Tau railgun, and also the emphasis on having units that can perform actions and take objectives. I'm not confident about this. I think the smaller, quick, sort of inexpensive vehicles like the Harlequin transports, or even like our Vipers, I think may still see a lot of play. But I think it's at least possible that initially we'll see fewer vehicles in the meta, whereas I think aspect warriors are going to be pointed quite efficiently for this kind of thing. Last note, and this is actually, so I'm going to transition into talking about the new secondaries. Last note on primaries, that is a good transition note. So the no prisoners secondary is still with us, and I think, based on all those predictions I just made, it's possible, and obviously I could be wrong about all of this, but I think it's possible that no prisoners will be an even stronger secondary option, because if the new meta incentivizes fast, small trading units, then the number of wounds of disposable infantry and bikes on the field is going to be greater. And so it may be easier to score no prisoners, which might be a slight gain for us, because oftentimes that has historically been a pretty good third pick for Eldar. And no prisoners has changed in another way, which makes it better. And that is, in addition to getting 1 victory point for every 10 wounds you inflict on your opponent's infantry and bikes, You get an additional victory point if you cross the 50 wound threshold, and an additional victory point if you cross the 100 wound threshold. And that can actually be a big deal, because now if you inflict 100 and say 11 wounds, I think that's kind of reasonable thing to hope for in a tournament game. Instead of getting 11 victory points, now you're getting 13. Now you're coming really close to maxing it out. I really think this is a solid. I know it's only 2 points, but I think this is a really, just in terms of percentages, you potentially increase your percentage victory point yield by somewhere around 20%, and that's good. That's solid. Okay, secondaries. So I'm really just going to focus on the secondaries that have changed in ways that I think are relevant for our army, which is maybe most of them. And for the most part, they're all positive changes. So psychic interrogation, that's the one where you need to be with, in its previous and current incarnation, you need to be within 24 inches of an enemy character, and then you need to perform this relatively easy to perform psychic action. It now does not require line of sight, and if you do this, I think you get 3 VP. If the rumors are true that at least some Craftworld psychers will have access to a stratagem that lets them perform a psychic action and still cast normally, this is actually a huge gain for Craftworlds, because this means that you can have your casters still use those powers that you're relying on to create synergies, and then perform a psychic action, which has a really low warp charge value, which you're very likely to succeed on in order to pick up a bunch of easy points. Now, people in the past have pointed out that one of the problems with psychic interrogation is that it disincentivizes killing your opponent's characters, at least until quite late in the game. I have rarely found that to be a problem. And I think not needing line of sight is just huge. I think that if we don't have to give up a casting slot, I think the only matchups in which this is going to be a bad pick are going to be matchups in which your opponent just has a significant amount of potent Deny the Witch, and you don't want to gamble every turn that you can outroll your opponent's Deny. But certainly against opponents who are light on psychers, this is fantastic. I think this is really suddenly is going to open up the Warpcraft options in ways that we've not seen in the past. They've been very situational up until now, and I think that if we get that stratagem that lets us cast and still do this, I think that this could, at least in some matchups, be really powerful. So the new version, next one, new version of Retrieve Octarius Data. So Retrieve Octarius Data was probably one of the 2 go-to secondaries for Craftworlds before, and for almost everybody, right? This is was one of the most popular secondaries in the game. Has been nerfed a bit. It's now called Retrieve Nachmund Data, and it provides 4 points if you can do it twice, 8 points if you can do it 3 times, and 12 points if you can do it 4 times. And the way it works now is an infantry or biker unit, bikers can do it now too, need to be within one of the quadrants of the table, at least 6 inches from all other quadrants. And they no longer just automatically succeed on the action. The way this works now is you roll a d6, and if the roll is equal to or less than the number of models in the unit, then you achieve the action. And you get to apply a -1 to the d6 roll if it's a troops unit. So if you had, say, I don't know, 5 Rangers, and assuming Rangers are still troops units post-Codex, they could not fail to do this on turn 1 somewhere, which is great. I think this is, despite the fact that we've seen that nerf, I think that Craftworlds are still going to want to lean into this in a big way. We have a lot of fast, probably optimally pointed infantry units. I think we'll probably see lots of 6 elf swooping hawk units running around. Well, maybe 1 or 1 6 elf warp spider, or maybe 2 in a lot of Craftworlds lists, so players can take this if they need to. It's just, I think this is something that we will excel at. I don't think the nerf is really going to be a big problem. Whereas other armies like Tyranids, which were relying on these 1 model action monkeys like Lictors to do this kind of action, they're really going to take it on the chin. And so I think this is a big win for us. The next thing that has, or the next secondary that has changed in a way that I think is potentially really relevant for Craftworlds is deploy teleport homers. It no longer requires you to survive a turn in order to score, which is, this is crazy. So suddenly this really opens up, because in the past, the issue with deploy teleport homers has been that Craftworlds just aren't robust enough unless you're like, I don't know, Deathwing Terminators teleporting into your opponent's deployment zone. This was tough, but now you don't need to survive. So potentially, deploy teleport homers really has teeth. You now score 2 victory points if you perform this action within 12 inches of your enemy's deployment zone. And this is good too. So it's not, and this had already changed, but so it's not a total loss if you can't quite get into your opponent's deployment zone. You can still score 2 on some turn when you didn't quite manage it. You score 4 if you're actually in your opponent's deployment zone. And if you consider the amount of CP-free deep strikers and really fast infantry units, again, I think this potentially is going to be good. But I also think that it's going to be a bit more situational than it might appear initially. And this is because I think we're going to see more MSU troop units and more armies running forward deploy units. And so because of that, it might actually be players' armies might be better, even if they're not intending this from the get-go, better at screening the midfield early in the game, because I think they're going to have more small units. And so it might be harder to get into position to perform this than it would be if we were using this in the current meta, or the meta as it was 3 months ago. I think most armies are going to be running forward deploy units if they have access to them, and that could make this a bit tricky, and it could mean that engage on all fronts is still the safer pick. I could be wrong. Engage on all fronts has been slightly nerfed. So now and when I say safer pick, I mean in most cases for most armies. I think you could absolutely build a Craftworlds list designed to lean into deploy teleport homers, and we have to see the new codex. It's probably quite doable, but I think we still may see more engage on all fronts in tournament lists. So engage on all fronts has been slightly nerfed. Now you need at least 3 models or the monster or vehicle keyword. So you no longer can do that thing where your warp spiders teleport into your opponent's backfield. You rely on their reasonably decent armor and -1 to hit to shrug off some small arms fire, and yeah, you lose 3 of your warp spiders, but you web of deceit somewhere else later and engage on all fronts and retrieve data again. Well, at least you can't do that anymore, right? Because for retrieve data, you need your spiders to survive in order to be able to do it reliably. And for engage on all fronts, you need at least 3 surviving models in the unit. And so I think we're just going to need to build more redundancy into lists. You won't necessarily be able to rely on a single unit of warp spiders to score you a bunch of points. Maybe it's 2 units of swooping hawks or something. There will be ways to play around it. But engage on all fronts also has really good synergy with the new primaries, right? Because there's all this emphasis on getting into your opponent's deployment zone, grabbing the objective in your opponent's deployment zone, grabbing objectives in the midfield. And so the primary scoring rules are going to encourage players to spread out more. And so I think that it will be easier, even though engage on all fronts has been limited in this way, I think that it's also being incentivized in this other way. I think we'll continue to see it despite the nerf in a lot of lists. Stranglehold has not changed. Some Craftworld players did really well with Stranglehold last go around. You score 3 victory points if you are winning the objective game at the end of your turn. And because we have fast units that are going to be incentivized to charge the enemy on objectives, then maybe this is going to be really good for us. And because Aspect Warriors presumably are getting a big boost, we theoretically could excel at this. I do think that it could be costly to try to keep seizing 3 or more objectives every turn and then see those units get wiped out. I'm just not sure Craftworlds are efficiently enough pointed to play that game. So we'll have to see. But I think that a lot of people are going to be looking at this very seriously, and it's certainly possible that it's going to be a pretty popular choice. I already talked about how no prisoners has changed and why it's good. And the last one is that Bring It Down has changed a bit. So it's gotten easier to score. Now models that are 10 wounds now give up 2 points when they're killed to the opponent, and models that are 15 wounds give up 3. I think this is probably mostly only bad for us. I don't know what the new data sheets are going to look like, but it's quite possible that Wraithseers or Wraith Lords will have exactly 10 wounds, and so suddenly they're going to be giving up twice as many points. Not great, but really, at the end of the day, also not that big a deal. So in a nutshell, that's it. New rules on how we can construct armies, no more sub-faction soup, new rules for how we score primaries. The secondaries have gotten a big shakeup. It's going to be a different game, but I think it's going to be a better game, and I think that Craftworlds are going to be in a great place when it comes to playing it. Obviously, this is all speculation. We have yet to see the codex, but I at least am feeling very optimistic, and hopefully, at least for those of you who are not big on sitting for hours with a new rulebook and poring over it, some of that will be somewhat helpful. Okay, that's it. Before I sign off, a quick shout out to my Patreons. Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate your support. This video is the one that you've been most pushing for the last couple of weeks. So now that it's out of the way, I can return to salivating over the new codex and maybe looking to get a couple of other guests on the channel for interviews. I have an Eldar retrospective coming up with a look back at Eldar all the way back to 1st and 2nd edition, and thinking about how the faction has changed while we wait for the new codex, and I have some other stuff in the works too that hopefully will be out soon. If you liked this video, please click like. If you have not already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. And if you have your own thoughts on Chapter Approved 2022, how it's affected the game and how it's affected Eldar for good or ill, please say so in the comments below. Thanks. That's it. I'll see you next time.